Okay, today's lecture is about a monetary history of Europe, to give you an idea of why we have reached the point that we've reached now. We use a common currency in most of Europe. How did we get there? That wasn't the way it was when I first came to Europe in 1987. Things have changed a lot. But to really understand something about monetary history of Europe and the process of European integration and the contribution of European monetary affairs to that integration process, you have to go back to 1870 or before, or even actually to, if you want, you could go back to Charlemagne in the 9th century when he tried to introduce a common currency to the lands that he conquered in silver. We'll talk about that maybe at the end of the course. But this is about monetary history briefly since 1870. But to get there, we have to sort of remind ourselves why we did this macro rerun last week. It's really important because to understand really what happened in the past 150 years, you need to have a framework to look at the facts. And like I always say, a good final exam question might be to interpret some of these events using ISTR, AICD. We don't do enough of that. Just like we don't do enough supply and demand analysis to think about things like oil prices or gas prices in Europe or in the world. So the lecture will start with the so-called Belle Époche, probably the most glorious period of Europe, liberalization, trade, and peace after 1873 up until the First World War. It was also a period when we used gold as a metric for international payments. I want to be careful when I say the word gold standard because it's kind of a broad term, but you should understand that back then it was a serious gold standard. So people really took it seriously. Each country had its own price of gold, which kind of defined all the bilateral exchange rates in the whole world, as long as you played by the games and the rules of the game. This ended with the First World War, which is a terrible conflict, of which we are constantly reminded when we look towards the Ukraine and see what's going on down there. It's really a very similar carnage that took place, but it was much worse in World War I. There was a recovery, a Great Depression, as you know, and World War II were all events, milestones that marked changing monetary relations within European countries. You know, now we live in a European Union. Back then there was no such thing. Trade was a bilateral thing. So if Germany and France wanted to trade stuff with each other, they had to sort of hash out an agreement, and then they didn't necessarily include the Italians or the English, and then there was all sorts of problems there. And then, so the only thing that was kind of unifying things was practically this monetary standard. So when it broke down, things kind of went haywire, and there was a Great Depression on top of that, bank failures all over the place, similar to what we saw, but much worse in 2008-9. And then, of course, World War II, the worst conflict the world has known. So all these things are awful events that led to a new monetary regime we call Bretton Woods. I'll talk about that. And the post-Bretton Woods regime that followed are based on some ideas on how to organize international payments. You know, because you still have, if you want to have trade, you got to figure out how to pay for it, what currency you're going to use, how do central banks deal with each other? Do we want to have central banks? I guess we do. Do we want to have gold as a benchmark? Maybe not. All that will be part of today's lecture. And then I'll get into why Europe, being this intensely concentrated cluster of countries with different cultures and histories and referential points, decided to get together and start some sort of a coordination mechanism to regulate the value of their means of payment against each other. So this was a big step. Helmut Schmidt, Giscard d'Estaing, in the 1970s, 1978, 1979, designed this. It was the forerunner of the euro. I know all of you weren't born yet. I was just a teenager, okay? So it was kind of an interesting time for us in Europe, for you, your parents. Okay, so let's talk about last time very quickly. Fixed versus flexible exchange rates is the question. So whenever you look at tackle a macroeconomic question in real life or on an exam, you want to ask the question, are we in a fixed regime or a flexible exchange rate? Or is there something in between that the government's cheating on? We call a dirty float. right? That exists sometimes too, but in macro, to fix ideas, we talk about these extremes. The most extreme case of fixed exchange rates being a common currency, and to the left of that, you might have what we had in Europe in the 1980s and 90s, and also what we had currently between Denmark and the euro. On the other hand, you have flexible exchange rates where the market determines everything. You have lots of effects of that, and most of them we know to be short run to medium run effects, but in the long run, it may affect welfare in the sense that people have to live with a lot of uncertainty. So then ultimately the question we want to answer is what happens if a country has a misalignment? What happens if a country has an overvalued real exchange rate? Or maybe even an undervalued exchange rate? It can also lead to economic dislocation or a temporary boom that one cannot sustain. The case of an overvalued exchange rate, in the case of Michigan, I keep talking about, of course, it's supposed to be a metaphor. My intent is to make you think about Greece or Portugal after the financial sovereign debt crisis 2009-2010. And to do that, we'll be focusing on these two regimes. So what's the advantage, what's the disadvantage of having a fixed versus flexible? If it was clear, we wouldn't have the other. It's always a balance. It's a judgment call. So you're the prime minister of a country, you basically get to look at the facts and decide what you want to have. In a fixed exchange rate regime, you have advantages. You have a shock absorber against financial shocks, but we saw in the section last week that a real shock coming from the IS curve, disturbances to real demand for goods and services causes an intensification because the exchange rate doesn't adjust and the full extent of the multiplier gets felt. Interest rates have to stay where they are because the central bank is trying to keep exchange rates fixed. If interest rates rise, that risks an appreciation of the currency, and the same thing goes in the reverse direction. On the other hand, fixed exchange rate regime provides stability of the real exchange rate. The real exchange rate. So if you take the purchasing power of France and Germany and use that to adjust the French franc Deutsche Mark rate, that thing is pretty stable. Why is that a good thing? It's good for business. It's good for planning. You know, if a French firm wants to invest in Germany, they don't want to face an appreciation of the Deutsche Mark that would make the investment less valuable, or at least imply uncertainty. Okay, so that's the same thing. You got a cost. So if you have a fixed exchange rate, you have to just throw away your central bank. Your central bank will be basically a money cash machine for foreign exchange transactions. That's the way I like to phrase it. And technically, it means that the central bank is intervening every second on the financial markets to keep the foreign exchange rate exactly in the band that they commit to keep. So Denmark has a central bank. It's an ugly building. I hope no Dane ever watches this video, but it is an ugly building. And inside, there are a lot of people who are actually trying to fix the exchange rate with the euro, because if they don't, it's not a fixed exchange rate regime anymore. But Denmark cannot call its own interest rate policy. It follows the euro. It follows the European Monetary Union. The flexible exchange rate has the advantage of having monetary autonomy and policy independence. So think of the Bank of England, having the Queen, now the King. I haven't seen him yet, but he's supposed to be on the banknote soon. That is supposedly a source of pride and joy for the residents of the United Kingdom. Fine. Also, you might have a little bit more independence in terms of calling your own interest rate relative to the others, but if you have a target inflation rate, that means you can't choose the real interest rate. You can only choose the nominal interest rate. But you can choose your own inflation rate. Those are all the lessons of last week. Right? That's why we need the ASAD to think about this. ASAD means the central bank, under flexible exchange rates, can call its own inflation rate. Every central bank gets the inflation rate it deserves. Every country gets the inflation rate that it deserves because they get to choose, presumably, the central bank and the central bank chairman. Now, what's the disadvantage? Milton Friedman said it was the greatest thing in the world to have flexible exchange rates. Ain't necessarily so, right? Because you have lots of buffer against real shocks, okay? But the nominal exchange rate can move around a lot, and that can cause deep stabilization at home, and including making it really difficult to make investment plans to invest abroad. Okay, so there is no clear-cut answer to this question, and that's why going into the monetary union The European way involved a lot of serious scientific thought and discussion, and some countries said, nay, we don't want to do it. Like Denmark still doesn't have the euro. You can go use it in Copenhagen, but they don't actually consider themselves part of the European Monetary Union, although they're part of the European system of central banks. Okay? And Britain left the euro, never joined the euro. They left the EU, so they're completely out. So you have all these different choices. But just want to make it clear that there is an advantage to having a fixed exchange rate regime that people always overlook. This is the real exchange rate, sigma, between Germany and France, bilateral. So it's the price of German goods in terms of French goods after you adjust for the price of the French franc in terms of German mark, and the price levels in the respective countries. This is sigma. This is the price of German goods in terms of French goods, or the price of French goods in terms of German goods. And look at this. This is up until 1995, 1997, 98. What happened after 1998? This is a date that should live in infamy for you, yes. The euro was introduced in 1999, okay? And it appeared on everyone's bank statement in 1999, and it appeared in your hands in 2002. So what do you think is going to happen? Suddenly, the exchange rate between Germany and France is equal to 1. French franc disappeared. I have a few at my house, and I have a few German marks, but they're gone, okay? You can still go to your national central bank and get some euros for them. I think they're obliged to do that, although some countries, I think in Finland, you can't even do that anymore, okay? But it doesn't matter. What do you think is happening after this? If I compute the same sigma using the same data after 1999, what do you think is going to happen? You're the one that always gets the answer right. It's going to be like a flat line, right? And that's exactly what happened. So if you're a French tourist coming to Germany, you're a German tourist going to France, you're a French supplier looking for a customer in Germany, and vice versa. Wow, that's stability. Okay, isn't it? Isn't that stability? Pretty impressive. This is up until 2000. This is up until the financial crisis. So people say, "Oh, what happened to the financial crisis?" Well, the euro survived, and the price level of France and Germany didn't explode. We didn't have a hyperinflation in either, or even a higher inflation in either. We had actually deflation, disinflation for a while. This is the longer picture. So that's stability. That's the advantage of having a single currency or a fixed exchange rate that's really fixed. Okay, so that's what I want you to keep in mind. The alternative is to have flexible exchange rates. This is the UK dollar exchange rate immediately following the vote on Brexit. Now imagine if you were a British UK business person going to the United States, making deals, and suddenly this happens. Or you're selling Cadbury candy in the United States, or you're importing American motorcycles. All right, so this is the kind of uncertainty that you have to hedge against. You have to buy contracts for future delivery of foreign exchange if you think you have future payments or obligations. And that's expensive because banks don't give it for free. They take the risk, but they also make you pay for it. You have a question?
How is the exchange between franc and the mark if there isn't that money?
Yeah, it's one. 1 euro, it has a little French guy on it, and 1 euro in Germany has a little German. They're the same. They're interchangeable. It's one way of thinking about it.
So the data before looks like an exchange rate.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. There was a number like 3.3 or 3.4. How many francs does it cost to buy a D-mark? And people in France use the French franc. And when I used to go there, when I lived there, you use the French franc. You can't buy bread with German marks. They'll look at you like you're Bosch. Okay, a tourist. But people do try it occasionally, right? People try to, can I spend this here? But it doesn't work, all right? Look at this one. This is the longer picture for the UK. This is what the UK has to deal with. Now, they have their own monetary policy. They can determine their own inflation rate, but they have to deal with that. They didn't always have to deal with that. Good morning. Moin, moin. Here's the UK before they joined the EU. What do you notice there? What's interesting about that picture? It's a flat line. They had fixed nominal exchange rates up until 1971. That's what we're going to talk about today. How do we get there? And how did Britain get away from that? Look at that volatility. Okay? So basically what this lecture is all about. So to do that, we're going to have to do this, remind ourselves what we did last time. Remind ourselves, we looked at the ASAD as sort of the way we're going to think about being able to choose your own inflation rate. Okay? So we have to remember the anchors. If you're in a fixed exchange rate regime, what is the anchor? What is the anchor that fixes the exchange rate, the inflation rate, in the long run? The foreign inflation rate. Okay, so again, accepting the foreign inflation rate is the consequence of being in a seriously fixed exchange rate regime. So Denmark effectively accepts the 2% goal that the European Central Bank propagates, if not completely always maintains. Okay, so that's the anchor. If you're in a flexible exchange rate regime, you can choose your own inflation rate. It's the target inflation rate. It's the Taylor rule, your personal Taylor rule. So you can choose 50%, you can choose 20%, or you can choose 2%. And if you're credible, people will eventually believe you, and they'll actually align their expectations. That's pi Schlange, pi tilde, is the expectation of inflation in the economy. That's the other anchor of our ASAD magic, okay? So policy is about shifting curves using fiscal policy or monetary policy. This is all review from last week or the last couple of years of your life. You know, hopefully you remembered some of this stuff because we're going to come back and use it occasionally. We're going to use it to think about Michigan. Because if Michigan has a crisis like we talked about last week or the week before, what does Michigan do? Michigan is a state in the United States. They have the ultimate fixed exchange rate regime. They have dollar to dollar. There is no Michigan mark or Wisconsin franc. You know, there's just a single currency. So you need nominal price adjustment. Wages and prices in Michigan have to kind of go down relative to those other guys. And that's what happened in Greece in 2008-9, but it took 10 years. I'm going to show you that. It took 10 years for that to happen. Painful for Greece. We know that, right? Nominal wages fall, prices fall in the depressed region. That raises competitiveness because sigma goes down. We become more attractive to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, to California. Increase our exports, import less, and that corrects the situation, so employment is restored. In the booming regions, if some guy next door is having a great time, that actually makes us more attractive. So these things kind of equilibrate. You know, it's not just a one-way street. A real exchange rate is always a bilateral relationship. And this is an equilibrating force. It is the equilibrating force in a fixed exchange rate regime if you have asymmetric shocks. That's come back next week. That's a really important finding, okay? Now, what other kind of forces we have? I'll go through this myself. Usually I call on the students to respond. It's pretty easy, right? We've done this already. Another equilibrating force is that people in Michigan leave Michigan. Young people migrate to other places. They go to California. They go to Texas. They go to Massachusetts. This is exactly what happened to Greece in 2009 and 2010. A lot of Greek people came to Berlin because there were jobs here. Now things are kind of switching around. A lot of Greeks are going back because Greece is really attractive now. They're growing again. They've reformed some of their economic restrictions on starting a new company. So maybe in a couple of years you'll think about going to Greece. Weather's great, okay? High wage places attract workers. Low wage regions deter workers. And if you're unemployed, it makes things even more attractive to leave and find a job. So this is kind of an equilibrating force, and this is also what happened in Michigan, and it's what's happening in Greece and Portugal and Spain in the period following the great financial crisis in 2009, 2010 for those countries. Capital mobility, we learned about that already. You know, it's not just a long-run force, it could also be a short-run force. So capital could come to Greece. German companies that make food processing equipment could start building food processing equipment in Greece, or selling investment to Greece, and Greece invest there to package the feta cheese to make it more attractive, which has happened, and made it more attractive for consumers outside of Greece to buy it. Or German companies could go to Greece and make hydrogen with all that Greek sunshine. All these things can happen as a result of low wages and increased capital rates of return. Okay? On the other hand, if people are nervous and thinking, well, this is not going to last and people are going to have a revolution in this country, they may not. So it's kind of there's an up and down. I mean, I would go to Greece and invest if the wages are low and they're falling. But on the other hand, you know, we have to be careful. It's a weak force. In principle, the rates of return should attract investment, and depressed regions should attract new investment, but there may be some political uncertainty as well. So in principle, it's definitely, capital moves in the other direction, but it may not move fast or quickly enough. So that's my reason for being a bit cautious here. And we look at Michigan today, it did benefit from some foreign investment, but it was not as strong as people anticipated, and a lot of real estate has gone down the drain in Detroit because no one invested and no one did anything with the houses, et cetera. So it's tricky, right? What's the fourth equilibrating force you can think of? So you're in charge of Michigan. You're facing this crisis in 2009. What can you do? You can try to do policy. You can't do monetary policy because you don't have a central bank. You can try fiscal policy. Very good. All right, so you can try fiscal policy. What speaks against fiscal policy? Michigan going it alone. First off, what would Michigan do? What could they do?
The smaller the region, the less important is fiscal policy.
Yes, because it's an open economy and the multiplier will be very low. Exactly. Okay, but what could they do? They could cut taxes. They could try to attract investment from the other states, just like Ireland does. They could do it like on an aggressive, and that's what they do in the states. They do that. So the representative of the state of Michigan will go around, visiting people and saying, look, we'll give you a low tax rate for the first 5 or 10 years. We'll do this and this and this. Okay, but somehow you're going to have to pay for the other kind of fiscal policy. You can cut taxes, you lose some tax revenues, but if you increase spending on bridges, for example, you build another highway, you got to pay for it. Where do you get the money? Small economy. Try to raise taxes. Can't do that. Can't raise taxes. You can run a deficit. You can borrow the money on capital markets. Maybe. If you're Greece, it might be difficult. Okay, so it's kind of a problem. In principle, you could cut taxes, raise spending, and the booming regions around you might start actually look less attractive because they might start cutting spending. I don't know, it depends. They could. They don't have to. Okay, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So it's a political thing, and it would be really nice if you could coordinate it. So what if the federal government could do that? The federal government could say, we'll take from the poor, take from the rich and give to the poor, like Robin Hood. That's called redistribution. Europe doesn't have a federal government like that. It has the Commission. They have very little power. The European Union takes in 1% of GDP in taxes every year. It's not enough to do serious redistribution. In the United States, federal government's really big. They can also choose to put a military facility there or invest in a research facility here. And the tax system is progressive, so it's automatically redistributing, right? It's automatically redistributing, okay? So you need a federal government, and Europe doesn't have that. So you see already some of the interesting issues that we'll talk about later. So Michigan is going to be forced to rely on force number one, nominal wage and price adjustment. because the other ones are kind of weak. So what does that mean? That means that nominal wages will fall in the depressed region, they'll rise in the other region, so sigma changes, and that will stimulate the economy, and that will sort of lead to a recovery. And we can use the ASAD to think about that. Okay, so the initial shock to Michigan was a leftward shift of the AD curve, and the question is, what happens? Well, we see that the point A, inflation is lower in the local region, which means that if you accumulate many periods, sigma has to fall, right? Big S is equal to 1. So if my pi is lower than pi star, I'm getting cheaper and cheaper every period. So over time, the AD curve the downward sloping curve, AS curve, and combined with a increasing competitiveness means the AS curve will start to shift as inflationary expectations are lower. People ask for lower wage increases, and then of course the AD curve shifts to the right because of the depreciation of the currents of the real exchange rate from the perspective of Michigan. Okay, so the Michigan can also try to accelerate that by trying to cut taxes, but we already learned that that doesn't work so well. So, you know, it's difficult. So you're getting a hint why monetary union ain't a cakewalk. Because if you share a currency, you're going to have to do something on the other hand to make this happen quickly. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck like Greece was at point A for many, many years. So that's the motivation for today's lecture. How can we understand European monetary history since 1870 in this context? And I think we can. Let's start with the gold standard. So in 1870, basically, every country for itself. The rise of nations, nationalism. And everybody wanted to have their own country. It led to ultimately to the end of some countries, like Austria-Hungary, multi-ethnic country exploded, right? Other countries kind of degenerated and fell apart. But one thing they all had is they had their national identity and their national money. And to make it credible and to make it exchangeable, you have to do something to make it tradable with other countries. So the way that these guys did it back then was quite easy. The simplest possible way to do this is just to define a single number, which is how much does gold cost in terms of my stuff, my money. Unilaterally, I don't have to discuss it with anybody. So Germany just says 6 Reichsmark is what an ounce of gold costs. The United States says an ounce of gold costs $35 or $32. Okay, so now you have to have some sort of thought process that leads to that number, but usually that was not a problem. It's interesting, if you don't have a central bank, then the government has to do this unilaterally in a different way. But and the United States didn't have a central bank in 1870. So it's kind of an interesting question, but we'll get to that in a second. So at the period of $20.67 was the cost of an ounce of troy ounce, which is not the same thing as a standard ounce of gold. Now once you do that, and if the UK says, well, for us, an ounce of gold costs 4 pounds, 24, that's in decimal units of the pound. Back then they had shillings and all that kind of stuff. Who knows? Who cares? That was the decimal value in terms of pound sterling. Why is that enough? Why is that enough information?
Because then you have the exchange rate, you have the gold, so you can just sell pounds, buy gold, and buy from that gold.
Correct. Right. Arbitrage is the word. Arbitrage on the exam. Arbitrage, right? It's just the triangle. You have to complete the triangle, because if there's a deviation that's significant, that exceeds the trading costs, the bid-ask spread and the transportation costs for moving the gold, then you could make infinite amounts of money by buying cheap and selling where it's expensive. Okay? So this implies a dollar sterling exchange rate. And like I said, it doesn't have to be exact, because no one's going to guarantee, the markets will guarantee that it keeps in that range. But it's up to insurance costs, shipping costs, shipping gold is really expensive. So there was some deviations, unless you could put it in a central warehouse and everybody agrees, okay, it's all right there, we'll leave it there. So you could have depository claims. It sounds like a bank, right? But you can't, I mean, gold is heavy. That's what makes it so credible. Okay? So 2 parities are sufficient to determine the third exchange rate, which is what we care about because British and American traders are trading goods for dollars and sterling. They don't care about the gold. They just want the goods. So this is the nominal exchange rate. So the logic of the gold standard is simply each country declares its unilateral parity, and we have this massive web of bilateral exchange rates, right? A lot of people say that's a pretty cool system. Seems to work. Don't have to, low maintenance. Each country just has to maintain its own parity. Of course, if you change it, it's kind of a problem. That's the system we had until 1914, till the beginning of World War I, all around the world. The Japanese, Chinese, French, Germans, Americans, the whole world. Okay? Sounds like a pretty cool system. Stable exchange rates. There must be a catch, right? So what's the catch? Yeah.
Inflation, then you have the problem that
Where does the inflation come from? Who starts the inflation? I mean, I don't know any alchemists, maybe you know one, but you cannot make gold. You have to find it, right? So it's got to be out there somewhere, and you got to get it. You can steal it, of course, but you can't make it. So we're constrained. Yeah, is that what you wanted to say? Yeah, okay, that's the corollary. But right now, the money supply is exogenous. It's not even a central, there is no such thing. A central bank can only, hold the gold. It can't really make it. It can cheat, and that's what happened later, but it's a serious gold standard, then you're constrained, you're hamstrung, you're tied by the chains of gold. That's what Professor Eichengreen calls it, the chains of gold, fetters of gold. So a lot of people think that's a good idea because it controls inflation automatically. We know in the long run, inflation and monetary growth, pari passu, right? They move together. Therefore, we're just giving up our freedom to control the price level just by letting the gold supply take care of it. But that's not a free lunch either, because if you discover gold in Alaska or you discover gold in California, like 50 years before, boom, or South Africa, boom, there's a lot of gold running around and that's causing inflation, right? So the central banks kind of developed in the 1870s, kind of cheating around the edges. First off, issuing depository certificates for gold, and these were kind of traded or claims on gold among central banks. So it kind of smoothed out these rough edges because it's really true. When the economy starts to boom, people need money, they need liquidity. So the price of gold starts to rise, then people start melting down the gold. And they start hunting for gold in the Klondike, South Africa. They start attacking other countries to get their gold so they can have more means of payment. Crazy, right? Not necessary. But it seems to work because people are convinced this is a serious monetary standard. So you said it, growth was volatile in this period. Okay? Growth was okay, but inflation was literally, I'm going to show you, was literally zero. Because the economy was growing, the economy needs more real means of payment, so the price level was just barely keeping up with this necessary liquidity. So some years the price level actually fell because the supply of money wasn't rising fast enough to keep up with economic growth. And you know from your history class with Albrecht Ritschl that the 1870 to 1910 period was a super interesting period for European economic development. Like Berlin was booming and people were getting wealthier, even the poor people were getting really wealthy. So in terms of improvements of standard of living, economic development, good times. Is everybody on board with that? So stability is not necessarily the case, because after Bretton Woods, you can see that growth was much more stable, lower standard deviation of growth, but maybe more volatile growth during this period of monetary shackles. Do you have a question? Okay. So this is real growth in France. This is the time series. I showed you a picture of table of numbers and averages, maybe not so instructive for you. Here you can see it from a time series. This is like from Madison's estimates of GDP from 1871 for France. So you can see there's a lot of volatility, and that can't just be coming from the real economy. It's coming from this constraint that there's no elasticity of supply of the means of payment in periods of high economic growth. And yet inflation was indeed lower. There's no question about it. So this is look at the first column of that table. This is times 100 is equal to the percentage per annum rate. So France had 2.7% inflation over the entire period. In Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods was almost 10%. And Bretton Woods means you print your own money, fiat money, okay? You're completely free from any sort of restriction. Again, I'm not saying anything is better or worse, but we have to be clear. Inflation was low in the gold standard. That's a plus. It's good for bankers. It's good for people who already have money, because inflation is always a threat to people who have money. It's not so good for farmers, because their prices are generally falling when you have deflation. That's what deflation means. But when you have really tight money, it means it's hard to borrow money. It's hard to finance new crops. And it also means that the price of your stuff is not going to be exploding, right? So the averages tell the story. In the Bretton Woods period, the pre-Bretton Woods are all have higher inflation rates than in the golden age of the gold standard. This is 1900 to 1913. You can see this is really a... But the problem is gold production. There's no guarantee that the supply of money in a growing economy will expand, because the banking system does not have the ability to elastically supply money to the people. It's hinged on gold. It's all based on gold. So this system is kind of doomed to failure. And well after this was kind of discovered in the early 20th century, central banks started to allow deviations from the gold standard. I mean, it wasn't, the UK did it first, allowing for very significant deviations from parity, and central banks were in agreement. They would hold sterling claims on the Bank of England. So Bank of England liabilities from the banking balance sheet of the Bank of England became a substitute for gold. So that's kind of the first hint, and this is what Keynes kind of recognized in the 1920s. This is going to be a source of problem. If an economy really starts to grow, who's going to get all the goodies? Who's going to get the advantage of creating the money to supply the economy? And a global economy, it's even more interesting. Yeah?
But if we theoretically would allow deflation, then it would work.
You could allow deflation, but we know that deflation is usually a time of redistribution away from poor people, away from, from people who are, especially farmers, people who rely on some stable prices for their crops, etc. If you're a banker, if you have a large, money position, if money's getting more valuable every year, good for you, right? Yeah.
If there isn't enough gold to supply the central banks, could they just change for example, the dollar gold exchange rate?
Exactly.
Previously it was you have to pay $4 for 1 troy ounce, and now you have to pay $10.
You got it. That's exactly right. And we're going to get there. That's the way to get out of the problem. But what do we call that? There's a horrible word for it. It would be a devaluation. So if people are hinged on this gold thing, they'll say, oh, my dollar's worth less than it was before in gold. So if you're Midas and you care about the gold, yes, it's not great. But for the economy, it's fine, because you're creating more liquidity, like you said. It's called a devaluation. This is a dirty word. And we'll see the end of Bretton Woods was all about the US dollar devaluing. And it's kind of a national humiliation if one country devalues. If the US says, oh, it wasn't $30 anymore, it's going to be 35, that means a lot of people get screwed, right? Because if you take the gold standard seriously, I can take my dollar every day and go to the bank and say, can you give me $30 worth of gold for this? And they say, yeah. And you say, okay, I take it back home with me. I'm not going to take the gold because I know it's there, right? But the moment you change it, you're going to get nervous and you're going to try to cash in right away because you're going to lose. So once you create an anticipation of a devaluation, you're already causing the avalanche to happen. So this is a problem with a fixed exchange rate regime in general, but with gold in particular, because you're talking about paper money and gold that you can put around your neck, maybe, make a watch out of it or something. Whatever else you do with gold. You had a question? Yeah.
Is the devaluation similar to inflation? Because in that case also the money gets devalued. Does it lead to inflation, for example?
It can if you devalue more than you should. So if we say $60 per ounce of gold, that means that the dollar is worth a lot less, and there will be a lot more liquidity, and there'll be a lot more money sloshing around the system. Okay, because effectively, you're decreasing the value of the dollar with respect to one benchmark. Everything else will adjust in the long run. Okay, so we'll come back to that. That's exactly right. Okay, so, the system worked fine. It was a good system. See you later. It was working fine, actually, until World War I happened. World War I ruined everything. It ruined trade relations. It ruptured, it was a huge disaster for Europe. Millions of people died in battles that were senseless. We think what's going on in the Ukraine is senseless now. Raise that to the third power. I mean, seriously, this is much worse. Destruction and resentment. And then the need to extract reparations from the losers. Because the winner always has to, just like we're doing now, we're going to take away all those boats from the Russians. All this is starting to build up. It's going to have the same type of implications as before. But I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go right to the Great Depression. Now, can you recognize that building? It's right behind this building. Okay, it doesn't exist anymore, but it is the Börse. It is the Deutsche Börse, Burgstrasse. Isn't that cool? It was a majestic building built in the imperial period of Germany in the late 19th century. It was the financial center of Germany. Frankfurt, nada. Everything in Berlin. Berlin was the center of everything. The Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, all these banks were here in Berlin. Commerzbank, banks you don't even know about. Okay, they were all here in Berlin. And this was the Burgstrasse. That was financial center numero uno of Central Europe. This is where it all happened. And this is what happened after World War II. Okay, unfortunately, it was torn down afterwards. The East German regime just tore it down because it wasn't worth saving, or it was a sign of capitalist imperialism. But how did we get there? Well, I mean, there were good times in Germany after World War I because after things got settled, Germany has this comparative advantage in producing machine tools and just in general machines. And then we had radio, mass production. The United States was developing all these assembly line techniques. They needed machines. The Germans made the machines, exported to the United States. There was a boom on the stock market because people recognized, hey, Germany is a good place to invest. Okay? And I'm going to show you a picture. Up until 1927, the German stock market here was doing really well. By the way, this was not part of the Humboldt University, which didn't even exist in 1927. It was the Berliner Universität. This wasn't a part of the Berliner Universität. This was the Handelshochschule Berlin. And people like you were training to be business people, mostly men, unfortunately. And there was a tunnel you could go through to get to the trading floor of the stock exchange. Literally, it was connected. And the reason why is because the Berliner Kaufmänner built this building, and it was dedicated in 1905 to further Berlin business interests and training. So this was a business school. This building was a business school until 1930 when it went out of business. So there's a little bit of interesting economic history for you, okay? Unfortunately, there was a crash in Germany before the stock market crashed in 1929. In 1927, in Berlin, there was a stock market crash in January. So a lot of Americans were invested highly in Germany, and they started to pull the plug. So what plug are they pulling? Look at this wonderful picture. That pink line is the stock market index of Germany. So you can see until 1927, it was booming. That's quite a boom. I mean, from an index value of, say, 50 to about 110. That's a doubling in a few years. So a lot of people got very rich. And this is well known. If you watch the Babylon, Berlin, Berlin, Babylon, there's a lot of references to that period. And there are a couple of guys in that movie, in that series, that actually are making money on this stock market boom. Now, what happens in 1927? It starts to crash. Remember Tobin's Q, stock market crash. People pull the plug on the investment plans, and capital goods production starts to fall. So we already have an incipient recession in Germany in 1927, way before the American crash. Okay? So this is what happened in the United States. 2 years later, probably because a lot of Americans, banks, and a lot of funds in America were overinvested in Germany, start to pull the plug, and they lose even more money, and then eventually the plug gets pulled in the United States in 1929. So this is the same type of picture in the United States, and you see the crash started in October 29, and as a result, investment collapses. So go back to ISTR. This is the I collapsing for exogenous reasons. People just completely shocked and postpone all their investment plans, and we have this massive incipient recession. Okay, but it got worse, as you know. It wasn't just a recession; it became a depression. And the question is, how did that happen? You know from your economic history. Collapse of investment. So it wasn't just a little bit of a drop. In the United States, it was 80%. I mean, imagine 80% decline in investment spending over 3 years. That's a big shift of the IS curve. Okay, so not surprising, output crashed by about 25%. Unemployment rose to 25%. Actually, output is crashing here by a third. Output is measured as GDP. Employment crashes by 25%. Unemployment rises to about 25%. And the interesting thing about the Depression is that it's an extended recession. It's much longer than it was in previous years, and actually in the post-Depression period. So this was special, and we know from the work of Ben Bernanke, who got the Nobel Prize, that it's because the banks contributed to this crash. Why? Because the banks funded the boom. They lent money to people to buy stocks, to invest in the stock market, with the hope that they will repay with their capital gains. Of course, things don't always go in one direction. Europeans didn't have the slow recovery that the Americans had, and that's because the American banking system also got crashed. So we need to discuss that as well. That's part of this Bretton Woods story. Collapsing economic activity led to a whole political movement in the United States. Those foreigners, they're undercutting us, and at the same time, the banks, we have to blame them for this because they lent money to the people investing in the stock market. So there are two political streams, and Herbert Hoover could not resist this. He was certainly not Donald Trump, but he had to accept it because there was this movement in the United States. We have to respond to this internationalization. Americans are getting ripped off. Basically, international tension against foreign exporters, like from Canada, from Belgium, from France, from the UK. They led to this movement. We have to put in tariffs and have basically to protect ourselves against these cheap imports. Now, another way of doing this is just to change the parity. Okay, the United States didn't do that at first, but some of the other countries did. So you were asking about the parity. If you change your parity and everybody else stays the same, your currency is cheaper compared to the others. So it's like a depreciation of your currency, and it kind of shifts your IS curve to the right, shifts your AS curve too. because it makes your goods cheaper from the foreigner's perspective. Okay? Now, if Belgium does that, it's okay. Americans can say, Belgium, don't do that. But if everyone starts doing that, then you have what's basically a beggar thy neighbor depreciation. Every country starts to get on the act. And Europe started this. I mean, I'm an American, but I think Europe started this. And America really tried to finish it. Because then they put in these tariffs. It wasn't, they said, we're not going to devalue gold. We're going to raise the price of European and foreign goods in general, Canadian, by putting a tax on the imports. So it sounds like Donald Trump. It sounds familiar? It's exactly the same argument. So what got the Americans so upset is the Europeans very early on started to change their parity. So they started to depreciate. So this is like the first 5 years. You can see that the Americans got in the act in 1932 after Roosevelt was elected, but the first 2 years they tried to keep it at 100, and the European countries were depreciating. So this is kind of what Keynes called beggar thy neighbor. You sort of do something, to better your own position at the expense of your neighbors, because by decreasing the price of your goods relative to the rest of the world, you make yourself more competitive. And it turns out that in the end, everyone got on the boat. And the reason why Germany didn't do this is because Adolf Hitler put in export controls and foreign exchange controls. So he really cut off Germany from the rest of the payment system, right? So you can depreciate. That's one way to make yourself more competitive. Or you can just become an autark, which is not a good idea. Okay? So this is what happened. This is a famous picture by Kindleberger. He shows the collapse of trade. This is like showing that the pattern of trade just went down the drain, basically, leading to all sorts of other agony that we can think about, because the IS curve keeps shifting back as you have less exports because other people are depreciating their exchange rate. The whole world kind of goes down together. At the same time, monetary affairs in the United States are going down the drain because I told you the government, the politicians were blaming banks. Your fault. You shouldn't have done this. So what happened? The banks that were most involved in the beginning were kind of punished by not getting bailed out. Okay, well, maybe the government shouldn't bail out banks. That's probably a good idea. But it also has it's like cutting off your arm despite your finger, right? You end up damaging yourself. We learned that the hard way in the 1930s. Monetary policy did not have a Taylor rule back then. It was basically ad hoc. The central bank basically said, we don't like this uncontrolled lending. These speculators have to be punished, and these poor people who work for a living are getting... And it turns out that by refusing the bank's bailout was bank failures. People started to go to the bank and take their money out because they didn't trust them. They said, oh, the Fed's not going to bail out Bank of America, then I better get my money out before the others do. So you have this rush to the exit. Okay? And we'll show you the picture in a second. As a result, monetary policy endogenously became more contractionary. Interest rates rose, and the money supply collapsed because banks didn't lend anymore. So we ended up having further impulses, negative impulses to demand, and the price level starts to decline. So you see this in the United States bank failure history starting in 1930. Okay, so there were obviously some bank failures in 1929 surrounding the crash, and then things were kind of calm. And then in the last few years of Herbert Hoover, things started to rise. And then by 1931, the first really banking crisis hit. And it also hit Germany. So these are pictures from Berlin in 1931. These are streets that you know. One on the top is in Kreuzberg. Okay, so these are all people trying to get into their bank to get their cash. There's no such thing as ATMs, right? You had to go actually stand in line, like when you go to have your Führerschein renewed or something. They didn't even have little numbers. You had to literally get in line, and people were starting to fight, Look at this. This is a disaster. And of course, most of these people didn't get their money. So what usually happens is they close the bank, and they say, well, we'll see what we can do. and maybe somebody will take us over who has more money, more liquidity, more net worth, because the banks that are failing usually have negative net worth, right? So if you go back to the balance sheet, the left-hand side of the commercial bank representative, on the lower left-hand side, the value of loans and securities starts to collapse. Because usually where there's smoke, there's fire. So a lot of these banks that were failing were also speculating themselves, right? So there's a rumor going around this bank was invested in a machine tool, AG, whatever, and the price collapses, and I'm going to get my money out quickly before you get your money out. And then, of course, everyone rushes in. So as a result, currency holding in the United States explodes. People want to hold currency, put money under their bed, right? It's not a bad alternative to not having anything, so people do that. And banks started to do this. This is exactly what happened in the great financial crisis. Banks start to increase their excess holding of central bank Geld, money, reserves. Right? So the whole economy starts to freeze up. It's like the plumbing starts to collapse. So the so-called money market multiplier that we thought was stable is collapsing. This is exactly what happened in 2009 after the financial crisis. Okay, so we have a rerun in reverse of what happened later. We didn't do what they did. So we didn't run the economy into the ground. This is what the United States did. They actually cut government spending. They cut government spending. This is Herbert Hoover in his last year. He says, well, we have to discipline the economy. We have to clear it's like when you go into the forest and you clear out the brush, stop forest fires, like Trump said. It's an okay idea, but you're actually making the economy worse. If you're cutting government spending in the worst possible time, you're causing output to fall even further. Okay, so we all know what happened afterwards. There was a war. And the United States government spending started to rise in 1938 when the United States started rearming for what everyone, I guess, anticipated was going to happen. And it wasn't just the United States. Somebody else rearmed a lot more, okay? And Keynes actually, in his book that was translated into German, the General Theory, he actually praises you-know-who for increasing government spending and creating jobs. I mean, imagine. And I know this for a fact because we had it in our library when I first came to Humboldt in 1993. Okay, I think hopefully no one's stolen it, but it's hopefully in the main library. The General Theory in German, first edition. After this, Europe is in shambles. How do we fix Europe? Well, people had this wonderful idea, let's get together and try to fix it. Let's do it right this time. Okay, so let's get together and have an international conference in 1944. The war wasn't even over yet. They were planning for the reconstruction of Europe and the world in a place called Bretton Woods. That's why it's called the Bretton Woods Conference. Okay, so it was in New Hampshire. It's a ski resort. It's been renovated recently. It looks pretty good. The idea was to simply, how can we design international payments to make it work better than it did before? Okay, do we want to have gold as a center of the system, or do we want to have something else? So this is a really exciting time to be an economist. Some really important people, Ragnar Nurska, John Maynard Keynes, a lot of people, Harry Dexter White, all these people, but they all had their own agenda. Everybody wanted to do their own thing. So you'll see this in a second. Now, Harry Dexter White was an American. He wanted to put the dollar in the middle. Okay, so you draw your own conclusions. The idea was, if you fix the dollar to gold and then everybody fixes to dollar, that solves a lot of their problems. The dollar is the center of the universe. Gold is like this little disciplining device. Maybe we won't depreciate too much. Maybe we won't depreciate at all. Okay, and then everything else takes care of itself. So this is one idea. The other idea was Keynes. Keynes was a real European. He says, he was an internationalist. He said, let's think international. Let's create a whole new currency. Let's not use the dollar, even though the dollar is great. Let's call it the Bancor, a synthetic currency. So we don't have gold anymore, but we'll have this Bancor, and we'll have some committee that regulates its supply. International. What a cool idea, right? So this is what Keynes wanted to do. By the way, there they are up there, Keynes and White. Kontrahenten, right? Actually, they were very good friends. Okay, so this is the idea. Bancor in the middle, gold at the top, maybe a slight discipline, and maybe it would be very cheap to devalue Bancor in terms of gold. So no national humiliation. This is where Keynes was spot on. Because if you make the dollar the center, then every time the dollar gets devalued, everyone says, oh, those Americans, untrustworthy Americans, trying to rip us off, right? The Bancor would be determined by, the value of the Bancor in terms of gold could be adjusted every 5 seconds or every 5 years. Now, isn't that a cool idea? So Keynes, hat tip to Keynes. Keynes did not win that debate. The White plan prevailed. So get rid of the Bancor. The Americans didn't like that. They put the dollar in the middle. Okay? So all these countries fix their exchange rate to the dollar. The dollar is fixed to gold, and that's it. That's what we have from 1946 to 1971, 73, depending on your Zeitrechnung. Okay? So this is what we had, and it is a regime of fixed exchange rates, and it actually surrounded the best economic performance the world had in modern history. If you look at growth rates, even in countries like in Africa and Asia, those growth rates were extraordinary. So fixed exchange rates have the silver lining of stability, but something had to give. We don't have Bretton Woods anymore, so something went wrong, right? What went wrong? So you said it before.
The economic growth was much higher than the gold production, and thus there was a too low constant monetary supply.
So basically the world grew faster than the supply of gold at that exchange rate. Meaning that if we wanted to do what you suggested before correctly, we'd have to keep adjusting the dollar, make the dollar a bit cheaper in terms of gold, create more dollars, depreciate the dollar. And the Americans didn't like that. National pride, maybe other special interests, who knows? Gold production did not keep up. This is called the Triffin paradox. Because in a sense, this system, this Bretton Woods system made the US dollar the center. It made the US central bank the arbiter and the guarantor of the value of the dollar. At the same time you have gold. How can that be? It's like squaring the circle. You can't do that. The Fed had to be ready by definition of a gold standard. The Fed has to be ready to buy and sell gold at any second at $30 an ounce, or whatever, 2067. At the time it was more like $32 an ounce. You know, and this price should not change because it creates anticipations. People will try to get all the gold before you can make lots of money if you can anticipate a change of the parity. So this is the problem, right? You create this speculative problem. And the US was growing so fast at the beginning, it was supplying the world with all it needed to reconstruct Europe. It was not a problem. The US could basically do this. But at some point, people want their gold. Just natural. And who do you think wanted the gold back? Who are the people that asked for the gold first? I have to do this, given that millions of people will watch this video. Les Français. So the French came to the United States in the early 60s and said, can we have a little bit of our gold? And the Americans were kind of upset, you know, clearly. And by the way this works, they don't ship the gold. They keep it in one place. So it's all in the Federal Reserve of New York, which you should visit if you have a chance to go to New York City. Go on the tour, go into the basement, check it out. I think they still let you look at it. In fact, one German representative, Bundestagsabgeordnete, actually demanded to go see the gold, and they went on a tour. And there's some great stories about that, but I won't tell you, okay? The US also has to be responsible enough not to abuse the privilege, because the US is now the central bank of the world. The US is basically guaranteeing to exchange gold at the parity. But as soon as you start creating anticipations of changing the parity, you create instability. So we really have to beef up gold production, melt down your jewelry, stop using it for industrial purposes. Is there going to be enough gold to support a growing economy like that? The answer is probably not. Okay? This is called the Triffin paradox. High growth because of reconstruction of Europe. Booming economy needs more money, and normally in the current system, the banking system, plus the central banks guarantee that supply of money. Back then, it was kind of constrained by the supply of gold, and the US did not want to devalue the dollar in a continuous, predictable way, which maybe it should have. So we rejected the Bancor plan and did the White plan, and the US basically gets the seigniorage. Because as soon as you say, okay, we don't have enough gold, the world needs money, the US can create the money at zero cost, just like every central bank. And the world is willing to use this. So how does the world get the dollars? How does the world actually get their hands on the dollars? The US has to, yeah, but how does the world get it? The world can't print it. How does the world get the dollars from the US? It's called exchange, right? So what does the world give the US for those dollars? Yeah. Goods, the stuff that gives us utility, right? I don't get utility from a dollar, but I get utility from goods. So the US has a kind of a privilège exorbitant. Exorbitant privilege. So the US could run current account deficits from now until eternity to supply the world with dollars so it can do its business, because there's nothing else they can use. So today, this is still a bone of contention. The Chinese have complained about this. The Europeans have complained about this. This European complained about it. And de Gaulle complained about it. But that's the way it is. The Americans would say, you started World War II and we finished it. Right? So, but again, can you still ask 70 years later to pay the price, or 80 years later to pay the price for World War II? So this is one of the burning questions of world economic payments right now. And I'll show you that in a second. This is called the Triffin paradox. Can't keep up. Somebody has to create the liquidity. The United States, per White plan, did that. And you can see, this is why the French started withdrawing their money. They saw it coming, right? They didn't withdraw all their money. That would be very antisocial, but they certainly started. And the dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. The central banks of the world use dollars to clear with each other. And this is a wonderful table, and I've actually updated it for you. You can see that at this, at the peak of the pandemic crisis, in the next slide, you see that the dollar became just incredibly demanded. And the Central Bank of the United States was creating lines of credit with European and Asian banks, and vice versa, of course. These lines of credit, have disappeared in the meantime, or they've been withdrawn. So the dollar is becoming a little bit less popular. The Japanese yen is starting to increase a little bit. This is all very interesting, because this is money that you'll never see. It's money that the central banks use to clear against each other, to protect themselves against speculative attacks if they're fixing exchange rates, or to bail out in emergencies. So where did all those dollars come from? They came from the current account deficits of the United States that started after Bretton Woods collapsed. So this is the absolute value of the US current account. Okay, remember what current account is from macro? You do remember. You don't remember. Who wants to help him? It's really important. It's very close to net exports of goods and services. So if you have a surplus, you're exporting more goods and services than you're importing. It also includes secondary income. So if you send your money to India or Turkey or whatever, it's a gift to them. You're exporting, you're importing goodwill. And if you receive money from your relatives, it's like you're exporting goodwill because they're buying it from you, okay? But it's basically the net, it's the opposite side of the financial account, which is how much are the foreigners investing in my country. So the flip side of this is that foreigners have bought more and more American assets, most importantly dollars, but also dollars to buy American real estate, to buy American factories, buy American stock, okay? So this is also what globalization means for the United States. Now, if you modify this and you put it in terms of GDP, it's a little bit less dramatic, but it's still pretty dramatic, right? So we can be thankful that we have a means of payment that everybody can count on. America is the piggy bank of the world, okay? But it also means that Americans have a privilege exorbitant. So this had to stop at some point because the Americans were losing gold, and the Americans had this gold in Fort Knox and the Fed, and they were saying, no, we're not going to give the family silver away. So in 1971, Nixon said, we're going to suspend convertibility. And then in 1973, the Bretton Woods system collapsed completely. This is a long time ago. I was like 14 years old, but I remember it. And that's what got me interested in economics, because I remember, Nixon and the gold standard. Nixon told the Italians some nasty things, because they were coming for the gold too. The Italians were coming for American gold. No good, okay? So the U.S. ultimately, why did this happen? This happened because in the 1960s, there was the Vietnam War. The social programs of the United States led to very large budget deficits, which translated into current account deficits. Too much demand at home. The Europeans were willing to sell goods to the United States to get those dollars, especially Germans. The Germans had a huge surplus with the United States, but also Japan, France, etc. Okay? When they abandon exchange rates, it's abandoning everything. It's abandoning fixed exchange rates. So suddenly we have this turmoil. Everyone's like flexible with each other, not so stable. If you're sitting in Belgium trying to export to the Netherlands, and suddenly the exchange rate system is like about to fall over. So what do? You needed a European agreement. So the Europeans went to the bat and said, okay, we got to do something. This is the first real evidence of European cooperation in response to the American-driven crisis, I would argue, was Europeans got together and said, look, we got to do something here. So the first thing was just central banks talking to each other. Let's peg our exchange rates. Let's have a snake in the tunnel. We have this upper and lower bound of bilateral exchange rates, and we'll try to do interventions to keep it like that. No gold, because we're off gold. If the Americans go off gold, everyone's off gold. Okay? And the price of gold exploded in the 1970s. I remember that. Yeah, you have a question?
I still have a question about the current account deficit. So that means the U.S. can consume more?
Yes.
But that's, for example, why Europe is so heavily invested in the U.S.
Yes.
But why is that a bad thing?
It's not bad. It just means that because part of that investment is holding dollars. And dollars is not a productive asset per se. I mean, you can invest it in a Yeah, just look at those statistics carefully. A big chunk and again, those are stocks, not flows. So a current account is a flow. It's an increment to the total net investment position. So what you see there is the accumulation of many years of current account surpluses with the United States. Okay? Other questions? So if you divide by GDP, your question, you can see that it's not, Americans are not getting away with murder. Okay, because the world economy is getting bigger, so if you scale current account by world GDP, it's not so much bigger than it was in 1970, but it's still very big, 2 to 3% of GDP every year. And if someday China says, I think we have enough credibility with our renminbi, we'll use that as may central banks start using that as a means of payment, then this would stop. It would have to stop because Americans can't export less than they import on a permanent basis. Okay, so the Europeans got together. I told you already about Giscard d'Estaing, the famous guy, finance minister, eventually became prime minister. He held hands with Helmut Schmidt, who was also an economist, by the way, one of the last German Bundeskanzler economists. Knew a lot of stuff. They said, look, let's do the EMS. Let's do this. We'll continue this next week, but I'll give you the introduction because you have to remember this. It's a little bit like the gold standard. So this is what I call the Munchausen system. Who knows what Munchausen? Who was Munchausen? You're all German. Munchausen. Yes? Do you remember Munchausen? Say it? Yeah, but how did he get out of the swamp? Did you do Deutsch as a Fach in high school? Yeah. Yeah. He was such a scammer, he pulled himself out of the swamp by his own bootstraps. Okay? So this is what the EMS did. The EMS sort of pulled itself out of this gold mess by creating its own type of gold. Okay? So, and this gold was called the European Currency Unit. It was literally gold, not. It was literally a basket of currencies. It was not gold. But they figured, well, we have some control over it. We'll figure out some way to do this. I'm going to have a picture in a second, and we're going to define some parities, just like the gold standard. And that would define the cross rates, and then we just have to get the central banks in the act to intervene in the markets to keep the price of the currencies constant, or close to constant. Yes? Yeah, exactly. It's like Bancor. They implemented Bancor with all the EU countries. That's what they did, okay? And of course, the problem with this is who decides on the parity. So, do the Germans get to say everything? Well, a lot of people didn't want to have that happen again, okay? So the French said, no, no, no. And then the Germans said, well, we don't want the French to decide everything, so we have to have some Democrat. Because this was Giscard and Helmut Schmidt holding hands. So this is already kind of a big event, 35 years after World War II, or 40 years after World War II, okay? So this is what they did. They created this ECU, European Currency Unit, as an alternative to a gold type standard. And literally, each country put a bit of their money into this basket. So it sounds like a mathematical, it is Munchausen. I mean, it sounds like a mathematical trick, but literally I put in 82 Pfennig, 82.8 Pfennig. You don't know what a Pfennig is? It's a decimal unit of a Deutsche Mark. And you put in 1.15 francs français in the basket, and you dump a pound sterling. What are they doing in there? Well, they were members of the EU back then. And this was all the EU members, countries, even the ones that never participated in the euro afterwards. Okay? The Irish punt. You've been to Ireland, you heard the Irish, you don't know what a punt is. That was their currency. Okay, so all these crazy currencies, put them in a basket, and then you define the parity vis-a-vis the market value of that basket. Now, how do you get that market value of that basket? You take the dollar exchange rate. So you have a dollar value of that. So it's kind of like an exchange rate crossed with some other standard. It can be any currency. It's traded heavily with liquidity. And this is exactly how it worked. This table shows the parities and the plus minus 2.5% trading range. The central banks were obliged to intervene to keep the exchange rate in the local currency center trading city within those bands. Okay, so you see, for example, let's take the famous German French franc rate. So if you take the column that says DM and you match it with the row that says France, how much did a French franc cost in terms of Deutsche Mark? Okay, and I think they took 100 Deutsche Mark. Did I get that right? No, how much would 100 Deutsche Marks cost in France? So how much would 100 French francs cost in Frankfurt? And the answer is 34 D-marks, okay? Technically 29.81 at the center of the parity and 25.67 at the bottom. So the central bank had to intervene in Frankfurt to keep the price of French francs trading in Frankfurt in that range. Similarly, if you move to the diagonal reflection, you see how much 100 Deutsche Marks would cost in Paris. So this is like one way of making sure that both guys are doing their work, right? They're both intervening to keep those. And this is the way the world worked for 40 years. I'm exaggerating. From 1978 until 2000. Yeah, I'm exaggerating. 22 years. Okay? But it meant basically the central banks had to intervene using their own assets, i.e. the French central bank, the Banque de France, would have to use German marks to intervene to keep the price in Frankfurt, using their traders, just like the Danish do. And in Frankfurt, the Germans would use French franc assets to buy and sell to keep the price of the French franc in Frankfurt from deviating from its parity. So we have the same system as before. We have the EQ substituting for gold. We had gold, now we have the EQ. And basically from that, you can derive all the bilateral exchange rates that I had in that table already. Going back to that table, all those cross rates, and the spread comes from this plus 2 or 2.5% plus or minus. And why do we have that? Because it's very hard for traders to react very quickly to big swings in the chain. So you have to do a lot of clever trading. And you're competing with the market, which has cleverer traders. So they're always trying to speculate against the central bank. Sometimes they're selling big time, like George Soros was selling the British pound when the British pound was in the EMS for a while. I'll tell you about that next week. Borrowing money in Britain and investing it in Deutsche Marks in Germany. So this is the kind of thing that we call speculation, and it causes a lot of people headaches, especially if you're a central banker trying to keep the exchange rate from getting out of control, okay? So this was a year when the participating countries were Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, France, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Austria. So this is when our book was published. This is from our textbook. In the meantime, some countries have come in, some countries have left, some countries have joined the EU. So joining the EU meant you became part of this EQ, and you had the option of joining the fixed exchange rate regime, but you didn't have to. So some countries said, no, we're not going to do that. Any questions? So it sounds complicated, but it is an improvement on having chaos. Imagine now you young people, you like to travel, you want to go to Czech Republic, you still have to buy the krona, right? You still have to buy the krona. But imagine doing that if you went to the Netherlands, Belgium, France. Everywhere there's a euro now, you'd have to exchange money. And every time you do that, you have to pay 5% margin to change into the currency, and you pay 5% to get out. It's expensive, right? And imagine what that would mean if you were a business person considering an investment, how to price your goods. Okay. So ultimately, next week, I'll tell you how this actually was affected. How did they actually do this? Like the central bank is the Banque de France. We already saw this last week. Interest rates in France are higher than they are in Germany. Then German investors take their money to France because they expect to get a higher rate of return. The French central bank cannot allow the French franc to appreciate against the German mark, so it has to sell its French franc and buy the German mark in Paris. Now, what is the consequence for that balance sheet in that instant? I'm asking you to think outside the box because you're usually thinking about Germany, but you're in France. You're the main currency trader for the Bank of France. Yeah. Yes. So they have to buy. You have to buy foreign assets. They have to buy the Deutsche Mark, and they pay to whoever sold them the Deutsche Mark. In France, these get deposited This is lendable funds. It becomes a source of an increase in the money supply, which will be multiplied in the lower left-hand balance sheet through the commercial banking system. So that's the problem. As soon as you have fixed exchange rates, you lose monetary power, monetary authority. What can you do to offset that? So I'll give you a little bit of a hint next week. So this is what the French and the Germans tried to do behind the scenes. They were clinging to monetary autonomy. They wanted to have that autonomy of monetary policy. So is there any way if you're the French buyer, if you're France and you're buying D-marks, it's kind of a comfortable situation. You're creating this stuff that only you can create, and you're buying these valuable D-marks. So what could you do if you wanted to offset that? If you're the central bank in that case. It's called sterilization, by the way. How would you sterilize that action? You could sell some other asset on your balance sheet. So look at all the stuff the French central bank owns. Claims on government. So it owns French debt. It made loans to banks. So it can retire some of that. It can actually just go off the market and sell and withdraw it. It's like reducing the size of the balance sheet. And that's called sterilization. So if you're on the buying side, that's good. But suppose the French franc is getting attacked and people are trying to sell the French franc to get the D-mark. The French central bank has to sell their D-marks. It's a finite supply because they can't make the D-marks. So what do you think they do then? They ask the German central bank for a line of credit. Okay? And that's not going to happen forever because the German central bank is going to say, we love you guys, but at some point you got to get your act together. This is ridiculous. Okay? So that's the source of speculative attacks. When people start to smell, the French government is not really supporting the central bank in supporting the French franc at its current parity. We think it's going to be devalued, so let's get out of there. You have a run on the franc, and it can happen everywhere. Anytime you have a central bank that's trying to fix exchange rates, you can have a run on the exchange rate. You have to have enough ammunition. You have to have enough reserves. Yeah. Good question. I love it. It's a great question. Ask your favorite politician. So I'm running out of time, but this is the greatest question for European integration. It comes usually at the end of the lecture, and when I'm finished with the entire course. Why does the Bundesbank exist? Why does the Banque de France still exist if they're not even fixing the exchange rate anymore? There is no exchange rate. That's what you were asking. So why? Politics. Any other ideas? Yeah. Yeah, national pride in a very particular respect. Exit option. Europeans still don't trust each other. Otherwise, the Germans would have said, France, I love you so much, I'm going to give up my central bank. Germany, I love you so much. Let's just divide the world into different districts that have nothing to do with countries. Let's have a southern German district and merge it with the French, Provence, and merge that with Austria, Steiermark, maybe go into Italy a little bit, have, like the Fed does. The Fed it's not based on states, it's based on districts, it's based on cities. There are 12 Federal Reserve districts. The Europeans didn't want to go that far. And I think that's a problem. Ultimately, it means that everyone is it's like, I really am going to stay for this to the end of this concert, but I want to sit close to the exit just in case I get tired, and want to get out of here real quick, and no one will see me. Exit option. So think about it. Okay, I'm done. Think about the écu, enjoy it, and there are some things you should remember. And this is the most fun lecture I ever had, so see you next week.